Do you like rats, reskin bosses, and beds of chaos? Well, I sure as hell don't. That's why today we're talking about the worst boss in each Souls game, from Demon Souls all the way to Elden Ring. I'm a simp for the bosses in these games, but we all know what goes up must come down. Let's begin, shall we? Starting with Demon Souls, we have the Dragon God. It almost feels cheap putting this as the worst boss because it's not even a fight. A lot of the bosses in Demon Souls tend to be more gimmick fights rather than actual battles, which is fine because a lot of them are still pretty enjoyable. But the Dragon God fight, if you can call it that, does not have a single ounce of fun and feels like a glorified game of hide and seek with a demon. But at least there are pillars. We all know pillars make genius boss design. And I can't knock FromSoft too hard for the disappointment with this fight because I'm assuming at the time they didn't really have the resources to make a crazy dragon fight, but the Dragon God is the face of the game, so you can't blame us for having some expectations. I think what I dislike most about this boss is the fact that even when you know the gimmick and how to beat him, it's still not easy. Which wouldn't be a bad thing if it was actually fun. A boss like the Adjudicator is super easy once you know the trick, but the Dragon God will still one-shot me repeatedly on subsequent playthroughs. All you're supposed to do is run and hide behind pillars until he looks away, and then you run to the next one. While it's still a bit lame, I do think the part at the end where you finish him off by hitting his bone is kind of cool. The Dragon God really isn't horrible from a cinematic perspective, but we all know that's not what we come to the Souls games for. Moving on to Dark Souls, I don't really think there's much debate here. It's the Bed of Chaos. I'll throw an honorable mention to the Capra Demon, but it's impossible to choose anything else besides the Bed of Chaos here. Once again, it's not even a fight, just hit 3 different parts of them and the fight's over. But getting to those areas is another story. Also, by the way, I wanted to thank you all for your support with the shirts. I hand make each one myself, and once they're gone, so make sure to cop one, link in the pinned comment. The Bed of Chaos basically has 2 attacks. One is a sweep with his giant branch arm, and another is him just knocking down the entire floor beneath you, turning a game where you can't jump into a platformer. And I can't believe I even have to say this, but yes, obviously I know there's a jump button. It's just not the easiest to use, and we all know it. This seems like a boss that could have worked in Elden Ring with Torrent and the jumping mechanics, but it just feels kind of lazy in Dark Souls. I will say it's very nice that the game saves your progress if you die, meaning if you hit one of the 3 areas and died, you only have 2 left when you come back. But with a boss run like this one, I think they just took pity on us for once and used it to make this disaster of a boss more bearable. Spoiler alert, it didn't help much. Next, we have Dark Souls 2, and with a whopping 41 bosses total, this one was interesting. As much as I wanted to put one of the lazy bosses here, like the Covetous Demon or the Skeleton Lords, I think they're easy enough to where they're not that big of a deal. I think the worst boss has to be the Royal Rat Vanguard, just due to the lack of creativity and enjoyment of the fight. Rats are already one of the most annoying enemies in the Souls games, so I don't know why they thought this would be a boss the community would be happy about. On top of that, this boss is the reward you get for finally making it into the pit in Majula, which was incredibly disappointing for me because I was so excited to see what was down there in my first playthrough. Basically, you kill a certain amount of rats in this little room until one with a sweet mohawk drops in, who you can take out in about 5 hits. This isn't the hardest fight in the world, but the amount of rats mixed with a small arena makes it easy to get stuck in a corner by these guys, which is one of the biggest problems I have with rats in these games in the first place. I'm assuming the statues here are supposed to help you, but they're nothing like the almighty pillars everyone loves so much, so they end up just getting in the way more than anything. The rats can also inflict poison and toxic very quickly, which is just a cherry on top that made this spot an easy choice for me. Moving on to Bloodborne, while there aren't too many bosses I'd consider to be bad in this game, I think it's safe to say that the Witches of Hemwick are one of the weaker bosses. I will say I find this fight more enjoyable than most of the others in this video, but overall it's just kind of boring. You're stuck in a room with a couple of basic enemies walking around that pretty much ignore you unless you run up to them screaming "attack me" like a true Souls masochist. Then you basically just run around until the first witch appears and lets you bash her head in with no real counters. But wait, there's a twist. Halfway through, another witch appears who also lets you bash her head in. And that's pretty much it. This fight was disappointing because I heard about this boss before I started my first playthrough in Bloodborne, and I expected a really cool fight with some witches flying around shooting magic, but all I got were 2 blobs that barely move. I thought I was on Reddit for a minute. Sorry, Reddit mods. The area leading up to the Witches of Hemwick was pretty challenging and creepy, which was exactly what I wanted, so I was pretty sad to see what came after. I don't know why FromSoft continues making bosses like these because they tend to be pretty much unanimously disliked by the community, but as long as we keep getting bosses like Gearman and Lady Maria, I'll keep my mouth shut. Next, we we have Dark Souls 3, another game that didn't miss too much in the boss department. I think the worst boss has to be Walnir. The Curse-Rotted Greatwood is a pretty close second for me, but at least it's optional and it does have a second phase. Walnir definitely would not have gotten this spot in my first playthrough, but after completing this game dozens of times doing different builds and challenges, he's easily my choice for the worst. A big part of my hatred for this boss is the mist that kills you pretty much instantly if you get too far beneath him. Usually it's pretty avoidable, but I found out if you take too long to kill him, you eventually get backed into a corner where the mist inevitably takes you out because you have nowhere to go. That was definitely on me because I was trying to do a broken straight sword run, but it still sucked because you can't really control how fast the fight goes besides your damage output. That's because he loves to keep his hand up in the air for decades, making sure the last bracelet is right out of reach for you. This boss is not hard at all, he just has a ton of little annoying things that make him super annoying to take down. Half the time I feel like I'm just roll spamming, waiting for him to put his damn arm down so I can hit the bracelet. It doesn't feel like skill, it just feels like RNG. I've had tons of playthroughs where I killed him in seconds thinking, how did I ever die to this guy? And others where I couldn't believe I ever had more than a 2-second window to reach his arm. The skeletons that he summons are also just an added bonus to make this fight even more of a pain, but luckily they don't get in the way too much. Moving on to Sekiro, I really love most of the bosses and mini bosses in this game, but I was never really a huge fan of the Guardian Ape. So you can probably guess my reaction when I saw the Headless Ape appear again a little bit later, this time with his boo. Luckily, this fight is much easier than the first Guardian Ape fight, but this was definitely not a boss I was looking forward to getting ganked by. The first phase is essentially the same thing as the first Headless Ape battle, lots of terror screams and jumping around the arena, nothing really we haven't seen before. The second phase is where he calls up his girl for backup, but luckily for us, her health bar is pitiful. Basically, my strategy for this fight was to run around in circles until they separated enough for me to get some hits in, which made it pretty easy to take her down first. Dealing with the camera is a nightmare as it is with all large enemies, but adding multiple bosses at once is what makes this one worse. On top of that, the combat with these enemies is pretty different than what Sekiro has taught you so far, which is why I'm not a huge fan of the giant bosses in this game. All throughout the game, they teach you to deflect and attack in a rhythm to break an enemy's posture, so bosses that broke this formula like the Ape and the Demon of Hatred weren't nearly as fun for me. Gank bosses are always controversial, and I think Sekiro is one of the harder FromSoft games when it comes to fighting multiple enemies at once, so it's safe to say I wasn't a huge fan of this boss. Moving on to the main event, the game most of us consider to be the game of the year already in 2022, we have Dark Souls 2 to Elden Ring. This one was hard to rank because Elden Ring has so many different tiers of bosses, so I just decided to choose from the main 12 bosses to make it more interesting. I was genuinely considering putting the Elden Beast at this spot, but I think that's a bit unfair since it was mainly due to my disappointment of it being the final boss. But I think this one's a no-brainer. The Godskin duo is just not a very well designed boss fight and definitely ranks the lowest of the main bosses. I really don't think this boss fight is horrible, and it's actually kind of fun with a summon, but the fact that it's required in order to progress in the game is where I think they started upsetting people. The classic Ornstein and Smo argument comes up here as well, since for some reason instead of having fast and slow attacks, they decided to just make them both fast. And the pillars, no, they were almost perfect. Not really. They knocked them down almost immediately, rendering them useless. You can cheese them with sleep arrows or sleep pots as you see me doing here, but that doesn't make them much better in my opinion, and I was only doing it for a video. It just felt like this boss was designed for you to use a summon, and while I like to have that option, I'd rather not feel forced to use one. Not only is the Godskin duo poorly designed, it's also a reskin of two bosses we've seen before put together. Separately, I actually really enjoy the fights against these two, but together they just don't work. It really just feels lazy, especially with all the incredible bosses that followed in the late game, which is why I gave them this spot. Also, for people who want me to do outros, I have one thing to say.